Genesis chapter 37. For the last couple weeks, we've been looking at and around a couple characters in the scriptures. We began with the character of Esau, and we started out of Hebrews chapter 12. We looked at Esau, how he had this root of bitterness that sprang up, that began to affect his life, and it was his bitterness towards his brother specifically, how he was robbed of a blessing, how he was robbed of his birthright. And then we looked at the character of Jacob. We saw this whole storyline play out from the perspective of Esau as the one who got taken advantage of, as the one who was deceived, as the one who was betrayed by not only his own brother, but then also his mother. His mother was in the process of stealing the blessing from Esau as well. And then last week we looked at Jacob's side of this story. And we saw that Jacob himself, who had many issues of his own, he was known as the supplanter, the heel catcher, because he was the twin of Esau, and when they came out of the womb, he was grabbing and holding onto the heel of Esau as they were being born, and he would be named this supplanter, this heel catcher, this deceiver. And this is a characteristic that would follow Jacob for a lot of his life, where he was trying to deceive and trying to wheel and deal and trying to get his own position and power, and always looking to tilt everything into his favor. And we saw last week where Jacob finds this location, and he has this experience with God. Well, there's this ladder that goes up into heaven, and there's angels ascending and descending on it, and the glory of God is at the top of it, and Jacob is asleep during this whole scenario, and he wakes up and he says, "The Lord was in this place, but I knew it not." He said, God was present here, but I didn't know it. I was unaware of it. Why? Because he was asleep. And when you're asleep, you're unaware of what's taking place around you. And he calls the place of that location. He builds an altar there, and he calls it Bethel, which means the house of God. Well, I think he was in the right location. He was in the house of God, yet he, even being in the house of God, missed the experience with God because he was unaware of what was taking place. We then find that 20 years later, Jacob would find and build another altar. This time, though, it's a completely different experience. Jacob has spent 20 years wheeling and dealing, trying to get his own way. In the process, he has also been deceived by his uncle into marrying Leah. And then he marries who he desires to marry, Rachel. But it's just a whole mess of things that are going on. He has some children, actually several children. He ends up having 12 sons and one daughter in the process. And he decides to return back home. But as he's on his way back home, Esau hears about it and is going to meet Jacob with 400 men. And in a sense, Esau is going to get revenge for all that Jacob has taken from Esau. And Jacob is at the end of himself. He comes to this river brook, and he sends his whole family ahead. And he stays the night on this side of the river bank. And that's where God meets with him again. However, this time, it's a wrestling match between Jacob and God himself. Jesus, I believe, in the flesh. Why? Because by him all things consist, and the entire of the Godhead is seen in Jesus bodily. That's Colossians. And so he's wrestling with God himself throughout the night. And at the end of that night, God reaches down and touches the thigh bone of Jacob, and he halts on it. He's unable to. You know, for you and I, when we stand, that we're unable to hold ourselves up if our hip or our thigh were to go out. And I heard another perspective this week, and I thought it was really good. The thigh or the hip bone is that which allows us to stand it also is what allows us to walk. It allows us to stand. It allows us also to walk. That gives us the strength and the power to do two of those things, and that was taken away from him in that moment. And in that moment, it was like God was communicating to Jacob that you cannot walk in this life, nor can you stand in this life in your own strength. And when Jacob was done wrestling there, all that he could do was hold on to God. He was literally holding on. It was not a wrestling match anymore. He was holding on to God at the end there and saying, will you bless me? I need your presence in my life. And Jacob builds a second altar there, and he names the place Peniel, which means the face of God. No longer was it just that he was in the house of God. He was in the right place. You're here this morning in the house of God. But I want us to go beyond just being in the right location. In Bethel, in the house of God. I want us to meet face to face with God, which is the experience that Jacob had. We looked at that last week. And Jacob actually goes back to Bethel, and he builds another altar there in that same location of Bethel. But he renames it El Bethel, meaning the God of the house of God. Jacob understood all this, but it didn't take away from the fact that Jacob would still have many failures in his life. Jacob would still be imperfect, just like you and I. Although we have been redeemed, although we know this God, although we know Jesus, it doesn't take away from the fact that you and I have daily choices, daily decisions that we make that affect us and it affects others around us. And so this morning I want to continue looking at the character of Jacob in Genesis 37. And we're going to look at specifically Jacob and his relationship with his sons. Oftentimes this passage of Scripture or the story is told like this. It's described as Joseph and his brothers. But I want us to look at this, and we'll pick up in Genesis 37, verse number 1. And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph being 17 years old. How old are you back there, Josiah? 17. So look back at Josiah, think 17 years old, that's Joseph. Being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. So again, whole lot of dysfunction going on here. Jacob has married several women, has children by several women. Obviously, we do not condone that. A lot of mess is going on here in the process. And so Joseph has several siblings that are half siblings. And so he has the sons of Bilhah with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Look at verse number 3. Now Israel, we understand is the other name for Jacob. God changed Jacob's name to Israel. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And we looked at this fact about in the story of Esau, that the favoritism that Isaac, his dad, had to Esau, and the favoritism that Rebekah, his mother, had to Jacob caused all kinds of issues in the home. And we know that favoritism never works. It just doesn't work. It causes so much dysfunction, it causes so much hurt, and it caused so much bitterness for Esau towards Jacob, Jacob towards Esau, and it just caused so much conflict in the home. Unfortunately, this gets passed down. Jacob, just like his father favored Esau, Jacob favors one of his sons, Joseph, over the rest. And he makes him this beautiful coat of many colors and places it on him. Verse number 4. And when his brethren saw that the father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. So do you see how that Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph now affected Joseph's brother's relationship with him? Do you see that take place? So no longer can Joseph's brothers have this good relationship with their brother Joseph because of the favoritism that Jacob had towards Joseph. And so what really was happening was not a conflict between Joseph and his brothers, although that comes to fruition. The greater conflict was actually the conflict between Jacob and his sons. There was bitterness and hatred that was taking place in the hearts of Jacob's sons. And we know that bitterness and hatred and anger all start with the root of bitterness, which we looked at several weeks ago, which is hurts. You know, this all started with hurts. This would have been a painful experience to be growing up in a home where dad favored one of the other children over you. That would have initially started as being a very hurtful action by a parent. And then it grew into anger, then grew into bitterness, and it's gotten to the point that they now hate their brother Joseph because of this. So we see, first of all, Jacob's failure. Jacob's failure. He failed, we'll see, to confront evil against his children. Jump back to Genesis 34, and we'll just touch on this real quick, and for the sake of ears, I won't really dive into it. But Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the country, saw her, he took her, lay with her, defiled her, and his soul clave unto Dinah the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel. And Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. So we see here, his daughter gets taken advantage of, and what does Jacob do? Nothing. Nothing. Well, huge failure on Jacob's part here. His daughter, his precious daughter, gets defiled, gets taken advantage of by this man who loves her, quote unquote, and Jacob does nothing. And because of his inaction, look at it, it says that he held his peace until they were come, talking about his sons. Look at verse number 6. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out unto Jacob to commune with him. And the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved, as any older brothers would. They were grieved. They were upset. They were protective over their little sister Dinah, and they hear what has happened to her, and they are very angry. Look at verse number 7. And the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved. They were very wroth because he had wrought folly in Israel in lying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. And this anger surges up in Jacob's sons. And I guarantee you, there was not only anger towards Shechem, the offender in this case, but there was also anger projected towards Jacob, their father, who did nothing. Do you see what a mess this causes in the process of relationship and the massive dysfunction that takes place here? And the sons of Jacob are so just angry in their heart that their father didn't protect their sister. Look at verse number 13. So two brothers take matters into their own hands. Look at verse 13. And the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father deceitfully, and said, because he had defiled Dinah their sister, and they said unto them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one that is uncircumcised, for that were a reproach unto us. But in this will we consent unto you, if ye will be as we be, that every male of you be circumcised, then will we give our daughters unto you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not hearken, so they write up this contract. What a messy contract it is. And they said, okay, you guys have to do the physical act of circumcision to all of your dudes, and that will provide the contract that we can now intermarry between our families, and we'll be all set and good. But Levi and Simeon absolutely were not following through on that. They were deceiving them. They were taking this into their own hands. Their father did not defend their sister, and they were now going to take this into their own hands. Look at verse number, let's see here. Verse number 24. And unto Hamor and unto Shechem his son hearkened all that went out of the gate of his city, and every male was circumcised, all that went out of the gate of his city. And it came to pass on the third day when they were sore, that the two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword, and came upon the city boldly, and slew all the males. It's a little bloody, a little messy. Who said the Bible wasn't full of, interesting stories? Verse number 26, and they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain, and spoiled the city, because they had defiled their sister. So all of this because their sister had been taken advantage of, and the older brother said, we're taking it into our own hands because dad won't do a thing. Look at verse number 30. Look at Jacob's response. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, ye have troubled me to make me to stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I, being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house. And they said, should he deal with our sister as with an harlot? Some strong language there. But the brothers say, hold on. Dad, you're concerned about your reputation over the safety of our little sister? You're concerned about what other people think about you over the safety of our little sister? And they were like, who cares? Can you imagine the bitterness and anger that has been building? And this is chapters before chapter 37, which is what we started with. I just want to give you the background of the anger and bitterness that is now rooted in the hearts of these sons towards their father, because he doesn't deal with things when he should. His failure in confronting evil against his children. He also failed to correct evil in his children. Look at Genesis 35, verse number 22. And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. What is his response there? Nothing. Again, nothing. Jacob refuses to address not only the sins committed against his children, but also the sins committed by his children. He does nothing. Reuben's immorality. Jacob's response was no response. Do you begin to put yourself in the mind and in the heart of Jacob's sons? And begin to realize, I think we judge them a little too harshly sometimes. And we realize, wow, they've been through a lot. There's so much dysfunction in that home. You got 4 different wives in the home. You got 12 children, 13 including Dinah, 12 sons, 1 daughter. You have all of this favoritism that's taking place. Jacob, who's supposed to be the dad, the protector, the provider, all of those things, is not providing protection, is not looking out for his children, is not addressing his oldest son, Reuben, of the immorality that he's involved in. He just looks the other way. We see Jacob's failure. We see Jacob's favor. We see the sons' bitterness and hatred towards their father because of Jacob's favor towards Joseph. This probably had much to do also with Jacob's favor towards Rachel. If you remember the story, you could go back and look at it in Genesis 29, where Jacob loved Rachel. She was the pretty sister, and he wanted to marry her, and he was deceived by his uncle Laban to work for her for 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, he was supposed to marry Rachel. Well, Laban deceives him and gives him Leah, the older sister, instead. Jacob then has to work an additional 7 years for Rachel. So Jacob, though, favors Rachel, his wife. It's interesting, though, that if you look at the character of Rachel versus the character of Leah, Jacob had his favoritism all wrong. If there is any good to come out of like two marriages here, it's so messed up. But Jacob's favors towards Rachel. Rachel was the one that stole the idols of her father. Rachel was the one that had control over Jacob and whether or not he could sleep with Leah. That's interesting. You can go look at that. It was Rachel that was kept barren by the Lord because of her attitude towards Leah. That's in Genesis 29:31. You can go look at that detail. She was the one that said to Jacob, "Give me children or I die." And Jacob had to respond with, "Am I in God's stead?" However, it was through neither of one of Rachel's sons that the Messiah would come. Isn't that interesting? It was actually through Leah's fourth son, Judah, that the Messiah, Jesus, would come through. Jesus would be called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's right. All of these things have built up this bitterness within Joseph's brothers, and that's where we arrive in chapter 37. In chapter 37, back there, we'll look at this. And jump down to verse number 19. This is where we'll pick up. We know that Joseph is favored by his father. The rest of the sons go out to keep the sheep and to find grazing spots for their herds. Find pasture for them. They were shepherds, they were nomads, and they had to travel long distances at times because this wasn't a well-watered area. This is the Middle East desert, although it was probably slightly different climate than it is today. They still had to search for green pastures. That's why Psalm 23 is really important, that the shepherd goes to find green pastures for his sheep. There was a lot of work that went into that, a lot of travel. And so these shepherds, this is what their occupation was. They had to travel long distances to find pasture for their sheep. And as they have camped out in this location where there is pastures, Jacob sends his son Joseph out to check on the sons, to give a report on what's taking place. And as Joseph arrives, and we know the story of Joseph, and I think next week we'll actually look at Joseph's story specifically. There's so many deep characters in and throughout this whole storyline. But Joseph's story is that he was a dreamer. God gave him some dreams that came directly from God of what Joseph was going to accomplish and what he was going to be later on in life. And one of those things was that he saw this dream of the stars of heaven bowing down to Joseph. He saw this dream of the sheaves of wheat that were 12 sheaves of wheat that all bowed down to Joseph. And he had shared this with his older brothers, because that was a smart thing to do. And his brothers hated him even more. They said, "What are you talking about? You're the littlest in the house. Don't even come to us with that." And so when he arrives here to them in verse number 19, and they said one to another, "Behold, the dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him." Do you see how that anger towards their father has now turned towards the favored son here, Joseph? And it was so full of anger and bitterness that they wanted to kill Joseph. And they said, "Let's cast him into some pit, and we will say, some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." You can catch the sarcasm that's in their voice as they're convening to put their younger brother to death. Verse number 21, "And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, Let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah speaks up here. Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Now, Judah, it sounds like, is a businessman, and he's thinking, you know what? Well, there's no profit in this if we just kill him. Why don't we make some money off of this? Do you see how far they've gotten in their thinking, in their hatred? But there is some, I believe, from the older brothers, Reuben and Judah. They realize the anger that is so welling up. And I think Simeon and Levi are one of those especially. Jacob will talk about those two later at the end of his life. That they were like a little hot-headed. And they were the ones that were ready to jump into action and do something about it, which is what they did with protecting their sister Dinah. And here they're so angry with Joseph, they want to kill him. And Reuben steps in and says, hey, let's just throw him in the pit. Judah says, let's make some money off of it. Let's sell him. Instead, he says, what profit is it? Verse 27, come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother. There's a little conviction in Judah's heart, where he says, he is our blood and flesh. Let's not lay a hand on him. Let's make some money off of him instead. And for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brother and his brethren were content. They said, let's sell him into slavery instead. I don't know if that's better or worse. Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So this whole process, and you can look at the details of that. I think what takes place is here, it's hard to decipher sometimes, but they throw Joseph into the pit at the direction of Reuben, their older brother. Hey, let's not kill him immediately, let's just throw him in the pit. Judah then says, hey, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, which are going by. But before they have a chance to pull Joseph out of the pit to sell him to the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, another troop of a caravan, comes by. They pick up Joseph, and they actually are the ones that sell him to the Ishmaelites, although Joseph's brothers had already sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites in their heart. That's why later it will say that they sold him. Although they didn't actually do the physical action, God still equates what they were thinking in their heart towards their action that didn't actually take place. The Midianites were the ones that picked them up. That's why in the New Testament, God would say, if you hate your brother, it's basically murder. Do you see how God equates our thinking with our actions? And so they had already sold him into slavery in their heart. And this whole process of this hatred towards Joseph was a result of their hatred towards their father. Look at verse number 30. And he returned unto his brother and said, the child is not. Reuben goes to check in on Joseph and says, he's not here. And he said, and I, whither shall I go? And they took Joseph's goat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. Now, if you recall, when we looked at Jacob's deception of his father, what animal did he use to cover his arms with skins and to produce a porridge for his father? What animal was that? Remember what that was? What was it? It was a goat. The instrument of deception that Jacob himself used towards his father in robbing the blessing from his brother Esau was the same animal that Jacob's own sons used to deceive their father Jacob. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father, and said, "This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no." And he knew it and said, "It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Do you see the amount of coldness in the hearts of Jacob's sons? That they deceive their own father, and they pretend to comfort him. They come and say, "It's okay, Dad. It's okay, Dad." They're comforting him. And all the while, I think, way back in the recesses of their mind, there begins to be some conviction for what they've just done. Years would go by. We noted the same animal that was used to deceive. You see that Jacob is reaping the consequences of his own choices. We'll look at Joseph's story next week and the playing out of this story. But I wanted us to focus in on this relationship between Jacob and his sons. There's so much turmoil here because of Jacob's decisions and choices and failures in his children's lives. And it created this huge divide between him and his sons. And this bitterness that grew in the heart of his sons would last for many, many years. Joseph is 17 at this time, and I think it's roughly 15 to 20 years later before Jacob would ever see his son, who he thought was dead. He thought he would never see him again. In Genesis 44, let's pick up there and we'll close. In Genesis 44, it's kind of the end of this storyline of Joseph and his brothers, but really it's a storyline of Jacob and his sons. In Genesis 44, in verse number 18, it says, "Then Judah came near unto him and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh." What's the context of what is taking place here? Joseph gets sold into slavery, and if you know the story, he then goes into Potiphar's house, the captain of the military of Pharaoh. And while in Potiphar's house, he is enticed by Potiphar's wife, who then blames Joseph for trying to take advantage of her. He's then put in prison for 2 years. While in prison, Joseph meets a baker and a butler and interprets their dreams. Out of that, those dreams are then passed up to Pharaoh, and Joseph then gets promoted. He gets taken out of prison. By the way, Joseph, in the midst of all of his dreaming, he never dreamt about being in prison. He never dreamt about being accused. He never dreamt about all these other things. God just gave him a little glimpse of the highlights of his dream. Joseph then gets promoted to second in command of the nation of Egypt, and there's a famine in the land. There's no food. And Joseph is the instrument that God uses to provide for Egypt and then also for the surrounding nations. Well, out of the surrounding nations comes some shepherds from the land of Canaan. They show up on the doorstep of Pharaoh's palace there, or the supply house that was there. And when they approach the platform there, there's Joseph, who is dressed now as an Egyptian. And his brothers approach, and he realizes, that's my brothers, immediately. We'll look at his story specifically next week. But here, Joseph then, I think, goes through this turmoil of wanting to he now has the power to enact vengeance on his brothers. And he basically tells them, hey, you go back. I'm going to give you some food. Go back to your home, but do not come back unless you have the youngest son, which is Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin. Well, when they decide, when he decides that, Judah approaches. Judah, remember the one that said, hey, let's make a profit off of Joseph here. Judah, look at verse 18. Then Judah came near unto him and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ears. And let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh. He says, my Lord asked his servant, saying, have ye a father or a brother? And we said unto my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his age, a little one, and his brother is dead. And he alone is left of his mother, and his father loveth him. And thou saidst unto thy servants, bring him down unto me, that I may set mine eyes upon him. And we said unto my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he would leave his father would die. Talking about Jacob and Benjamin. And thou saidst unto thy servants, except your youngest brother come down with you, ye shall see my face no more. And it came to pass, when we came up unto thy servant my father, we told him the words of our Lord. And our father said, go again and buy us a little food. And we said, we cannot go down. If our youngest brother be with us, then we will go down. For we may not see the man's face, except our youngest brother be with us. And thy servant my father said unto us, you know that my wives bare me 2 sons. Speaking of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. And the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn in pieces, and I saw him not since. And Judah relates this story back to Joseph. And this is what he says at the end of it. He says in verse number 33, now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant, meaning Judah himself, let thy servant abide instead of the lad. Joseph says, hey, I want you to leave my little brother here with me, and you'll go back home. And Judah steps up and says, we can't do that. Sir, I'm sorry. We cannot do that. We cannot leave young Benjamin here with you. We've already lost a brother. Our father has already lost a son. Let me stay instead. Do you see the change of heart in the sons here? And we'll look at, the beauty of this story next week and the conclusion of it with Joseph and his brothers specifically. But we see here that over these 15 to 20 years, a change has happened in Joseph's brothers. And Joseph recognizes it here. Joseph's brothers have changed in their heart towards their father. It was cold when they said, let's deceive, let's kill a goat, and let's tell our father he is dead, he's been torn to pieces. And now they really think that Joseph is probably dead. He was probably sold into slavery and probably died into the hands of the slave-driving Egyptians at that time. And they think he's dead. And now here their heart has changed towards their father. They now care about what their father feels. And Judah steps up and says, no, please, you cannot take Benjamin as well. I'll go in his stead. Please do not do this to our father. You see, I don't know what happened in those 15 to 20 years, but something happened in the hearts of those sons towards their father. And we see that we don't really see a restoration of relationship between Jacob and his sons. There doesn't come a moment in time where Jacob apologizes to his sons for what he has done to them, how he has failed them, how he's favored the other sons over them. None of that takes place. None of that is seen in Scripture, but something happened in the son's heart towards their father that it changed. Their hearts changed towards their father. And when I see just across this whole story, all the characters that are involved, I can only conclude that God's mercy is overwhelming in these stories and in these characters. Now, you and I can pick up the scriptures and read Jacob's story, Esau's story, Joseph's story, Judah's story. What a mess it is. Aren't you grateful that your story isn't in the scriptures for somebody else to read? What a mess we are we not? What dysfunction we have in our families. Families is some of the hardest thing to deal with. The messes, the relationships, the parents, the cousins, the sisters, the brothers, all of that causes so much turmoil. But what I see and observe in this dysfunctional family, which are called the chosen people of God, what? Out of this is supposed to be the chosen children of Israel? How is that even possible? The only conclusion we can come to is it's the redemptive and merciful grace of God in their lives. That's all that we can come to the conclusion of. Jacob and all of his failures, and God still uses Jacob. God still is merciful. See, I wrote these things down. We see the Lord's mercy on Rachel in allowing her to have children. We see the Lord's mercy on Leah in seeing her affliction. It says that specifically. God saw the affliction of Leah and gave her children. We see the Lord's mercy on Jacob's sons in allowing their needs to be met in spite of their hatred towards Joseph. We see the Lord's mercy on Joseph in allowing him to go through what he went through and yet giving him favor everywhere he went. Joseph said at the end, "Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass as it is this day to save much people alive." The whole purpose of God's redemptive story is salvation, to save people, just like Joseph said there. The messiness that you and I are, we're called here to Camas, Washington, and into the Portland metro area. Do you think God chose perfect people to do that? To reach them? Absolutely not. I am dysfunctional. I am broken. I have failures. Please stop nodding your head back there. We are all broken. We are all imperfect. We all have massive failures in our life, and yet God's storyline is always redemption, is always salvation. You see, it's through the tribe of Judah of all people, that the greatest Messiah, the great Messiah, the greatest Savior of the world and of his people would come. Through the tribe of Judah. If you look at Judah, you're just like, whoa, what a mess. You see, even in through the characters of like Jacob, who we see absolutely all the failures. And then even through the story of Joseph, who we'll look at next week, we're like, Joseph was like, dude, this was a good guy, right? And Jacob was like a bad guy. Yet God somehow works in and through both to accomplish his work, to accomplish his salvation, to accomplish his redemption. And that's why it can only be the work of God. Because if it's our works, if it was based off of Joseph's works, that would fail. His good works. And if it was based off of Jacob's failures, well, absolutely it would fail. That's why it only rests on the mercy and graciousness of our God. We see the Lord's mercy on Jacob in confirming the Lord's covenant with Abraham to make of his seed a great nation. When it comes to the character of Jacob, who the more that you look at his character, you're just like kind of disgusted. You're kind of let down, like, wow. Why would you use him? But I want us to turn that around this morning and look at your own self. And self-reflect. Think of Saul. Looking at his own life, he was a murderer of Christians. And he had to self-reflect, and I think he did that for those 3 days and then for 14 years in the desert. Just like, oh my goodness, I can't believe what I've been doing. And came back. And he says, nevertheless I live, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. He realized it had nothing to do with Paul. It had nothing to do with Saul. 25 times in the Bible, the Lord calls himself the God of Jacob. The God of Jacob. Not the God of Israel, what God changed his name to. He said, I'm the God of Jacob, the supplanter, the deceiver, the heel catcher. I'm the God of even that dude. And for you and I, when we look at ourselves and we see the mess that we are, we see the dysfunction that we are, all that we can conclude, and God still says, I'm the God of Aaron. And that should make us so grateful. for the mercy of God in our lives, God's mercy on all these characters. But then let's look at ourselves, at the mercy of God in our lives that so overwhelms us. Let's finish with Lamentations chapter 3. You may know this passage, but Lamentations chapter 3. Just after the book of Jeremiah, Lamentations chapter 3. Verse 21 says, "This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. His mercies, they are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." I'm thankful and grateful for the mercy of God. I'm going to sing a song. Actually, my dad mentioned it this morning. I was already planning on singing this morning. But it reminds us of the mercy of God. And as I play and sing, you just in your seat there, if you need to come down and kneel before God and say, "God, I'm grateful for your mercy in my life." It should move us to a place of gratefulness. Even with the dysfunction of who we are, even with the mess that we are, the mercy of God so overwhelms our sin, the grace that is greater than our sin.